Hi, podcast listeners. I'm excited to introduce you to this episode with one of our fantastic law lecturers, Dr. Folashade Adeyemo. Fola talks us through her research and teaching on aspects of banking law, such as whistleblower protection, fraud, and unexplained wealth. And we also get to discuss the life of an academic with her and how she juggles her teaching, research, and side projects. Enjoy. Hey, well, a very warm welcome to you, Fola, to the Discover Reading podcast. And we'll kick things off as we do on all our episodes and just ask you to introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Fola. I am a lecturer in the School of Law. I'm the Deputy Director of Admissions and Recruitment and the undergraduate tutor as well. I have three main research areas. So I'm interested in financial and banking regulation, interested in whistleblower protection, and I have an interest in financial crime. So in terms of banking regulation and supervision and that kind of banking space, I have a book coming out in December. And that book looks at banking regulation in Africa with a specific focus on Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. Secondly, I have an interest in whistleblower protection. Particularly, I'm interested in it from the UK perspective, but also from the African perspective. So my earlier research looked at whistleblower protection in Nigeria particularly. So it looked at the Whistleblower Protection Bill, which has still not been enacted into law. So it's still a bill since 2007. So my earlier research focused on that particular space in that particular area. I then had a paper published last year by the Journal of Business Law, still on the issue of whistleblower protection, but now in the financial industry particularly. So a lot of my research areas are very interlinked with each other. The third branch of my interest is in financial crime. And I think I can share this now. So I have been offered another book contract to write on financial crime, specifically regulatory responses within the area of unexplained wealth. So I am still looking at Nigeria and I'm also looking at Kenya. So that's it in terms of my research. In terms of my teaching, I teach banking law and company law on the LLB program. Banking law is a module that I introduced in 2020. And it was really interesting because we weren't expecting to have that many students, but we ended up having 191 students in the first year. And then in the second year, we decided to open it up to the students in the business school. So on that module now, we have students who are accounting and finance, business students who are also on that module. And we have almost 200 students. Same with company law. Typically, we have maybe about 105, 106 students. But again, we've opened it up to the students in the business law school, and this year we have 164 students. The banking law module, and I suppose it's a bit of shameful self-promotion, is the most popular module on the LLB program. It's the one that has the most students as of when I checked last.
Fantastic. So it's a super busy time for you, loads of students, a book coming out, another one on its way.
It's a busy time, but I love what I do. And I think it's really helpful that the students are quite in tune and quite keyed into what it is that, they're learning. I can definitely say with my experience with the banking and company law, the students have been really, really in tuned. They mostly prepare to the classes. And I always issue this disclaimer at the beginning. And I say to them that the tutorials are it's not a mini lecture. So you need to prepare because I'm going to ask questions. And so far, I've not had to kick anyone out of class. So it's been good.
Fantastic. One of your research areas that you mentioned was sort of whistleblowers in financial crime. Could you say a little bit more about that? Just because I think we do hear about kind of whistleblowers in the news quite a bit, and that kind of just grabbed my attention as something that's quite interesting.
Yeah, so I think in terms of whistleblower protection, I mean, definitely from the Nigerian perspective, I'd say that they're not really protected at all. And so from the Nigerian angle, there is this approach of or there is this, you have to take into consideration the cultural and the local complexities of Africa as a whole. Then when you bring it to the Nigerian angle, it's not really a common practice to report on your boss engaging in fraudulent activity. It's just not it's not something that's expected, quote unquote. The second thing, I suppose, is that if someone were to report, the likelihood is that they would get punished and that they would be fired from their role. And so because of that fear, I suppose there's not that they don't whistleblow from a moral perspective, because they're thinking, well, if I say that this person is doing something wrong, what is the incentive for me? Is it just that I have a clear conscience, or is there going to be some kind of financial reward, for example? So that we don't actually have a Whistleblower Protection Act, in Nigeria. And again, people won't whistleblow because there's no incentive for them to do so. If anything, it just makes it harder for them, because if they are then found out to be the person who's whistleblown, it's either they make their job really, really difficult and live in hell for them, or they just fire them. So people aren't, quite interested in blowing that whistle unless there is some kind of incentive. Now, in relation to the Ghanaian angle, and it's really interesting that when Nigeria put together its whistleblower protection bill, it's a direct replica of the Ghanaian Act. I think the Act is 2006, if I'm not mistaken. But interestingly, Nigeria decided to take out the section. So if you whistleblow in Ghana, there is some financial incentive. But if you do so in Nigeria, even though it's not an act yet, there's no provisions to make any kind of financial incentive. So it was interesting to have those two views when I presented at that session, and just compare themselves. I think to answer your final question, in terms of England, I mean, I wouldn't say, my argument has always been that the act is not as effective as it possibly could be. I mean, it's since 1988. I think it's time to have a more robust law that really adequately protects people who come forward and whistleblow on bad practices.
That answers it perfectly. One thing which we always like to do at the podcast is, with our guests, is really dig into their background and see how that formed their opinions as to where they are now. But am I right in saying that you originally trained as a barrister? And I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, and then how you got into academia.
Do you know, every time I tell this question, tell this story, people never believe me. So I hope that you do believe me. So originally, I just wanted to do my law degree, do a master's, get married, and just be an educated housewife wearing Prada. And that just didn't happen. So, well, it hasn't happened yet. So you are correct. I did originally train as a barrister. So I did my undergraduate degree in England. I did my master's in England as well. I did it at Brunel University. I went to law school in Nigeria. So law school in Nigeria is slightly different from England in that you qualify as both a barrister and a solicitor, whereas in England you qualify as either a barrister or solicitor, although now you can qualify as a solicitor advocate. So I did originally train as a barrister. I decided that practice wasn't for me. And whilst I was in law school, I applied for a PhD and I got an unconditional offer because they were really impressed with the proposal. And it's so interesting because even though they were happy with that proposal, that wasn't actually the final product of my PhD. So originally I wanted to look at financial stability in England, and then the banking crisis happened and so many other different things. And I thought, actually, let's put an African spin on this and look at it from Nigeria and some other countries. So yes, that's kind of how I got into doing the PhD. As to how I got into academia, I actually started teaching in my second year of my PhD. So I started to teach at a college affiliated to my university at the time. So I was teaching criminal law and public law, and then I applied for a role at Kingston University, and they called me in for an interview. It was really informal actually, but it was, yeah, I was offered the job on the spot and I started teaching there. So I taught there for about a year, and it's super interesting because the head of school at the time asked me to teach company law, and I said to her, this is about 4 or 5 years ago, I said to her, I've never taught company law before. I don't think I can teach it. And she was like, no, Fola, I had this faith in you that you can do it. And I said, okay. So I taught it and it went really, really well. And then I taught it to master's students. That went really well. And then when I was looking for a full-time role, I obviously applied to Reading, and believe it or not, they were looking for a company law lecturer. So I think the stars really aligned for me in that respect. Well, God and the stars really aligned for me, and it was just really good timing that I had that experience and I could bring it into Reading. And so I've been convening the company law module since 2018.
Yeah, we also wanted to ask you about, so just to go back to your upcoming publications that you mentioned before, could you just tell us a bit more about what your first book is about and what your next book will be about?
I can do that. So my first monograph is on banking regulation in Africa. And what that book really explores is the effectiveness, if you like, of the banking regulatory environment in Nigeria. And it really looks at whether the legal framework is effective enough. I keep saying effective because I'm trying to think of another word or another kind of phrase, but it really just has a look at the regulatory environment. It considers the law, particularly. So Nigeria has a new banking law act, Bofia 2020, which was enacted. Instead of me doing my book, the book was actually supposed to come out last year, but for one reason or another, COVID and many other things, I had to delay it. And it was actually quite good that it was delayed, because it meant that I could actually start to include Bofia 2020 in it, and also to preserve the shelf life of the book. Because I think if I had published it, then a lot of the stuff may have been redundant. So it looks at the law, it looks at the regulatory institutions, it looks at the banks. It focuses primarily on Nigeria, but it also includes South Africa and Kenya in the discussion. Kenya was quite influential in terms of the deposit insurance scheme after the structural adjustment program in 1986. So when Kenya created their deposit insurance scheme, Nigeria then followed. So a lot of the discussions are interconnected with each other. In terms of my second publication, which is forthcoming, we don't have a date on it, but I suspect it will be the end of next year. That book is particularly on financial and economic crime, and I've decided to use Nigeria and Kenya again as two jurisdictions. Now, one of the reasons I've decided to focus on African countries before I go to the context of the second book is I have found that Africa seems to be left out of the discussion a lot when it comes to not just banking regulation, but different books, different areas, different topics, different themes. So when you're thinking about banking regulation, normally what you hear is England and Wales and Australia and the US and Spain and Portugal. You never really hear about it from the African context. So I wanted to do something different and actually include Nigeria, not just Nigeria, Africa in that conversation. So going back to your question on the second book, so that looks at financial and economic crime in Nigeria and Kenya, and particularly it focuses on something that we call unexplained wealth orders, and that essentially is when somebody demonstrates an abundance of wealth but it doesn't actually match the income that you know that they have. So let's say, typical example, I'm a lecturer at the university, and then suddenly you hear that I have a house in Chelsea. I mean, unless it's a family house or something I inherited or I married into money, that would obviously raise questions that how did you manage to afford this kind of house, when if we go on jobs.ac, we can know what the average salary is of a lecturer. So it builds on that. And of course, when you're having that discussion about corruption and fraud and money laundering, Africa does tend to feature quite heavily in that conversation. So I just wanted to take that a little bit further and explore the legal regimes and the laws. How do those laws help or combat against this ongoing discussion about fighting corruption and unexplained wealth? You know, what are the measures that are in place and how do they adequately, if they do, address that?
I think you are spot on in terms of quite often when we look at all these big global issues, quite often Africa is perpetually left out of the issue. I think a good example of that would be when we look at investments from the US and China and that huge global rivalry which is coming. What often receives not that much attention is China's massive investment in Africa and the way that is shaping the geopolitics. And if I was to give a little podcast, shout out the China and Africa podcast, that's what I do. And if those guys want to return the favour, please do feel free. But I was wondering, just for a bit more kind of context in terms of this situation, because you've mentioned a few banks there. What are these banks? Are these national banks, or are they much more regional African banks? Those banks?
So, well, I'm looking mostly at commercial banks. So in the Nigerian context, it would banks such as Zenith Bank, GTB Bank, well, GT Bank as they're called, but I believe they've changed their name now to GT Co. So these are like the large, if you like, systematically important type of banks, in the same way that you have the Lehman Brothers, you know, too big to fail, and that kind of concept. So those are the banks that I looked at in the book from the Nigerian context. And as I mentioned, the book primarily focuses on Nigeria. And I probably should also mention this, that this book is the first book since probably 1991 that adequately addresses or moves the conversation along in terms of banking regulation in Nigeria. There have been other attempts, and you know, there are definitely other scholars who are talking about it in the not in the way that I've done so. So I've provided a really clear history of banking history. So I've looked at banking failures. I looked at the first banking law in Nigeria, which was the Bank Ordinance of 1952. I looked at things like the Pattern Report, which looked into exploring the regulatory environment at the time. I looked at the indigenous banking system, where these were banks that were wholly owned by Nigerians. I looked at colonial banks. So it has that really deep historical analysis that some scholars have tried to look at, but in the form of perhaps journal articles or reports. But this is the first textbook that actually gives that holistic type of view on it.
And in terms of financial crime, that was very interesting. But because you mentioned that basically you have people stating that they have assets or they have accumulative wealth, which they clearly don't have. Is the issue across the whole of the African continent, or is it actually focused upon a few major countries in the region?
So I think it would be unfair to say it's across the whole Africa. In the book, I'm focusing primarily on Nigeria and Kenya. I can categorically say that they have that problem. They have that problem of corruption. They have that problem of fraud. They have that problem of government officials being in official careers or institutions, and they're having houses in Atlanta, they have houses in Dubai, they have all this expensive jewelry. So a typical example might be a judge. You know that a judge's salary can't be more than, I don't know, give or take £1 million naira a month, which is maybe £1,000, £2,000. So where on earth is this judge having the funds to be able to purchase a house in America? Where is this judge being able to, send their children to the best schools? And I'm not saying that you shouldn't send your children, just explain to us where you've got the money from. And more often than not, in some instances, and like I said, it's not the case for everyone, but in some instances you find that it's because some judges are collecting bribes. And so that's what some of the book will explore. I put a disclaimer that I am still conceptualize the chapters, but I'm still having to do quite a lot of research into this area. So I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm sure that every country, even in the UK and even in America, everybody has their share of corruption and fraud and, and all of these unexplained wealth issues. But my focus at this time, where my research is taking me to, is in Africa. So.
We're also thinking in terms of, and we often say to like prospective students that lecturers' research feeds into their teaching, and that's a real kind of strength of university, that you're learning from world experts in a field about cutting edge aspects of that subject. Could you talk us through how that works a bit more? How does that actually translate into the classroom?
So we tend to adopt something called research-led teaching. So our research is reflective within our teaching as a whole. And of course, many of my colleagues do this, and I don't want to start naming names without their permission, but many of my colleagues have textbooks, for example, where it informs the way that they deliver a particular topic to the students, and they have that experience because they've done a lot of research and they have a lot of knowledge in it, so it's easier for them to translate that to the students in a way that they understand. I think for me, with my banking law, for example, even before I published this book, I have a few articles and I would put it on the recommended reading list, for example, for students and say, this is what I've written about it. do have a read through, but also have a look at what other people have written in this way. So it's helpful that we do the research, and I'm quite fortunate to be able to teach in the area that I research in, because I think it also helps me deliver the course with more passion, because I know so much, quote unquote, about it. So and I hope I'm able to deliver it in such a way that they understand, given firsthand that I do active research in it. So my research has a big effect on the way that I deliver with this book. Although it comes out next year, a lot of the things that I talk about in terms of banking regulation and supervision, so I'm able to give them that first-hand experience, that this is what I've researched, this is what the scholars are saying, and this is how it relates to the topic that we're learning about.
That's fantastic. And I think that's what makes university classes so interesting, is that aspect, definitely. I was also wondering whether it works kind of the other way of, have you ever had sort of seminars and discussions with students that have triggered something to make you think, oh, that's a good idea, I might go and do some research on that? Does it flow the other direction too?
It does. And, I'll be honest, in one of my banking law classes last year, we were talking about money laundering and fraud and unexplained wealth. And it was when a student was talking about unexplained wealth, and I'd been already trying to conceptualize the idea. How can I make this more relevant? What can I kind of contextualize this into in such a way that I can include Africa into the conversation? I won't forget, she did have a presentation on fraud and unexplained wealth. And I thought, oh, actually, this would be a really good idea for a paper. So I started thinking about it, started conceptualizing, and I confess, I've got it on my computer somewhere. I've been working on that paper for 1 year. I'm not at the end of it. And that often is the case with many papers and many academics. It sometimes takes a year just to get a really good piece out. And your earlier question in terms of how do you manage and how do you balance it, sometimes that's the case with some of my colleagues. They get a really good idea, but they're so inundated with teaching, it's like they don't have the headspace to actually really formulate those ideas in such a way that they can put it on paper. But the ideas come, and sometimes even when I'm reading through students' dissertations, I go, oh, that's a really good idea. So yeah, sometimes the students actually give us these ideas or raise important questions, and you think, oh, this is something that's not really been addressed in the literature. Maybe it's something I can explore in some more detail.
That's amazing. And that must make it much more fulfilling, I guess.
Definitely.
Great. And in terms of all the work that you're doing at the moment, me and Chris did notice that you're also the founder of Mentorship Direct as well, which is must be another big piece of work for you to work on. But wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that and how you have time to run it.
I certainly can. So with Mentorship Direct, I founded this when I was at the end or towards the end of my PhD. And one of the things I struggled with during my PhD was finding a mentor or finding someone that I could speak to and somebody that really understood some of the problems that I was experiencing during the PhD course. And it's so funny that one of my colleagues and friends that I actually work with, I actually just sent her an email. I remember I was really upset that night. I hadn't met her before, but I'd seen her on LinkedIn, and I said, I need you to mentor me, otherwise I'm going to stop doing my PhD. I kind of roped her into it. So she started to mentor me, and, obviously a friendship then grew to a degree, and then obviously now we work together. But I suppose that this Mentorship Direct was also born out of the fact that I realized I couldn't have been the only person suffering from I don't have a mentor, or I need some kind of direction, or I have all these different questions. What is the way forward? So I reached out to a couple of friends, a couple of connections that I knew, different people in science and law, because those are the two aspects that I knew I could adequately focus on. I had a really good friend at the time who was into science. He was a GP and he had a network of people. And then I was obviously from the law background. So what we do with Mentorship Direct is I would mentor somebody who's in the law space. So we start usually from university level, maybe first year, second year. And we're there for them, we mentor them, we give them advice, we forward any work experience, any relevant work experience that we think might be helpful for them. And essentially, we're just there as a sounding board, if you'd like. not counselling or anything like that, but just anything to do with the course that you're studying, anything to do with the direction that you want to take your career into, or even if you're not sure, we can recommend different organisations that you can be part of. So there's one, British Nigerian Lawyers Forum. It's an amalgamation of barristers, solicitors, different types of people within the legal space. So we can introduce you to people in that space. If we know someone who can offer you work experience, we could do an introductory email. But yeah, one thing I also make quite clear with the mentees is that the mentors are there. We're here to help you, but you have to come to us. We're not going to force ourselves to mentor you, okay? And that's something I had to learn the hard way, that if you want something, you really need to take that step, be that proactive person in trying to get to that thing or get that person's attention. So if you want to meet with your mentor, for example, you have to contact them and see when they are free. They have to fit you into their schedule.
It sounds like a brilliant initiative. I think having that, particularly when you're quite young, having that third party you can bounce ideas off, you can get their opinion on, is quite invaluable. I was quite curious just to know that if you want pairing people, do you take into account their personality types and think they'll make a good pairing, or is it much more, it doesn't matter what personality type the mentor is, it's up to you. The emphasis is much more on the mentee.
Yeah, so we send out an initial form, which is like a questionnaire, and we asked a range of different questions. And I just remembered, Phil, I didn't answer your question on how am I able to do all this, so I'll come back to that. So yeah, we send out a questionnaire. We're interested in what kind of area you're interested in, for example. So if it's criminal law, then you're more likely going to be matched with someone who is from the criminal background, because it seems you'll be able to get more valuable information and advice from them. Or if it's commercial or, within the commercial space, we'll fit you in with someone like that. So there are different questions that we ask. What stage are you at? What are your long-term plans? What are your short-term goals? And so we use all these different factors, and also mentors availability, because I think that also plays a part. So you can match someone who is interested in criminal law. Maybe the mentee needs a lot of guidance, but maybe that mentor can't offer that guidance. They can offer it on a smaller scale. So there are different ranges and different factors that we take into consideration. Now, to answer your question, Phil, you said, how am I able to? So I have a team that I work with. So I founded it, but I have someone who manages the inbox, for example, because I can't do everything. And when the requests come in, then we have somebody else who kind of sifts through the requests and does some initial kind of pairing, and then I have an overview of it, and then they make an introduction. So it's more of a team effort, I would say, because I can't possibly do all of it. I would probably burn out even more than I am now.
Very impressive indeed. Phil, do you have any final concluding questions?
Any kind of shout outs you want to do, Fola, in terms of the mentoring scheme, or anything else people should learn more about what you do on? Well,
I want to thank me. Actually, I want to thank myself for giving myself, no, I'm joking. I don't really have any particular shout outs. Shout out to my friend Nkechi. She's really been helpful in terms of helping me with Mentorship Direct, but not just helpful. When I started conceptualizing the idea, she was really my sounding board. I ran all of my ideas past her, and she gave me really good advice. Same with Kenny, who helps me manage the inbox. She's really good. She's very effective and very quick to respond to emails, which is really helpful. And obviously, it just shows that we're a serious organization, as it were. So big thanks to the two of them. And I thank myself for putting myself through what I put myself through so that I can make myself available.
Fantastic. I think that's a brilliant, positive and uplifting note to go and end on. So, Fola, it just remains for myself and Phil to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You've been a brilliant guest, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that was a brilliant, fascinating chat with Fola. I think we touched upon some interesting avenues there, all about financial law, financial irregularities, a good focus upon Ghana and Nigeria, not to mention the very useful insight into the eventful life of an academic as well. And the good news is that our next podcast will also touch upon law as well. We welcome Ruby Ziegler to the podcast to go and speak about Human Rights Day. We look forward to touching base with you guys then. All right, ta-da.